Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Arena's Writing Your Political Resume series, module number 3, which focuses on our writing. So the first big piece of advice we have to give is make every word on your resume count. Make sure that every single word that you choose to include on your resume is buying you something, that there's no filler or fluff in your resume in the writing. And we want to go through some tips on how to do that. I want to start with this George Orwell quote. This is a quote we talk about a lot here at Arena. It's part of our style guide for the organization, and I want to read it to you. Never use a long word where a short one will do. If it is possible to cut out a word, always cut it out. Never use the passive where you can use the active. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday equivalent. So these are some of the core tenets of how we can think about writing our own resumes. First and foremost, we always want to be using strong active verbs. Bullet points should articulate what you did and the impact it had. So we want to use those strong active verbs either to address what you did or to address a little bit about that accomplishment. And we will talk more about that as we dig in. So let's talk about some of our favorite active verbs. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but it can give you a chance to see what we're talking about in terms of active verbs and brainstorm your own list. Words like managed, led, trained, mobilized, built, recruited, implemented, planned, engaged, developed, facilitated, increased, one of those words we can use to talk about accomplishments, right? So all of these words are strong active verbs that you want to think about using to start each of your bullet points. So let's look at an example. This is a resume bullet point, and I'll read it to you. It says, worked with a team of 5,000 volunteer texters and 78 volunteer leaders. Right? So what stands out to you about this bullet point? What do we think it says about what this person's role was? For me, the answer is just not clear. It's hard to tell what that person's role actually was. Worked with could mean a lot of things. Were they just a texter on the team? Were they actually in charge of the team? Were they just helping? It's really not possible to tell because words like worked with and responsible for are not those strong active verbs. So let's look at an alternative. Led and trained 78 volunteer leaders who managed 5,000 volunteer texters to send 4 million GOTV messages, right? So what stands out to us here? Now we can really tell what that person's role was. They were a leader. They were in charge of that program. They led and trained those 78 volunteer leaders who then went on to manage 5,000 volunteer texters, right? So it tells me something about how they can build a program that can scale. In fact, you can see that they were able to scale this program because they talk about sending 4 million GOTV messages. That's a terrific metric to include in our resume bullet points. So we can see how trained really gives the hiring manager such a much stronger idea of the kind of work that you did and the capacity that you have as you would approach this new job. So speaking about that 4 million GOTV messages metric, it's a great segue into our next bit of advice, which is always quantify your experience. You want to highlight the metrics that are relevant to what the employer is looking for. It might be, how many people did you manage if you were a manager? How many voters did you mobilize? If you managed a budget, how big was that budget? How many people did your content that you created reach, right? You want to always think about ways to quantify that experience. So we're going to give a couple of examples. Here's a list of bullet points, and we can see what might be missing here to help make the case. It's metrics, right? Managed a budget for a red to blue state Senate race. That's fantastic. Was that budget $500 or was that budget $500,000, right? Mobilize volunteer leaders and volunteers. How many leaders? How many volunteers? Onboarded staff members and led weekly trainings. How many staff members? What kinds of different things were you training them on, right? Developed and managed relationships with political partners. How many partners? What types of partners, right? Drafted a comms plan and landed pieces in local and national newspapers. All of these bullet points are at their core strong. They lead with active verbs, right? They talk about what you did, but they really don't get at that impact by showing us the scale of what you did. So let's look at an alternate version. What stands out to you here that makes these bullet points stronger, right? Here we see in that first bullet point, we managed and drafted a budget of over 1 million from a red to blue state Senate race. So that shows me the scale at which you were working on as the person who managed that budget. We mobilized 52 volunteer leaders and 1,875 volunteers in the state's largest congressional district, right? So a couple things going on there, some great metrics, right? A solid number of volunteer leaders, a solid number of volunteers recruited, but also your metrics don't just have to be those kind of hard numbers. Metrics can talk about relativity. So this was in the state's largest congressional district. Relative to the other districts, this was the largest one. And that gives a hiring manager a sense of scope and scale. Let's jump ahead to developed and managed relationships with political partners, including SEIU, Planned Parenthood, and Empire State Indivisible, right? In this one, we're not necessarily saying we developed and managed relationships with 3 political partners, right? Which would be using a hard number metric. We're giving examples, and that's showing us that we have a breadth of experience working with unions, working with advocacy organizations, working with local grassroots activists, right? So that gives us a sense of the sort of diversity of political partners that you worked with. And dropping in that you were able to raise some money through these partnerships, raise $36,000. That's a really strong accomplishment that you want to be highlighting in your bullet points. If you're in comms, drafted a comms plan and landed 9 feature articles in local newspapers, as well as 2 cover stories in national publications, right? So giving a sense of how much reach your content had. We have a terrific tool here at Arena in the Arena Toolbox called Gathering Your Metrics. It's a great tool for you to download now as we're headed into, at least as I'm recording this, headed into GOTV in the 2022 cycle, but it's going to help you think ahead to the kind of metrics that you want to always be gathering as you go, because it's really important not to wait until the end of the campaign to gather your metrics, because once you're done with the campaign, you start losing access to email systems, you start losing access to the digital platforms and a lot of these tracking places where these metrics are tracked. So make sure you have a plan before you're fully into GOTV to grab those metrics at the end of the campaign and throughout, so that you can have this information to use in your resume. Next, we want to talk about how our bullet points should always articulate accomplishments and not just responsibilities. So again, bullet points should articulate what you did and the impact it had. And we always want to use those strong active verbs to lead each bullet point. So by way of example, instead of saying ensured that organizers attended public events to recruit volunteers, right? That was your responsibility. It was your responsibility to make sure that those organizers attended public events and that they recruited volunteers. You could say something like coached a first-time organizer to overcome nerves around public speaking, which led to a 20% increase in recruitment at church events. This is actually called the CAR method, and it's something that we have a worksheet that you in this module that you should go ahead and download from the Arena Toolbox. It's a great tool that will help you think about the challenges you had to face, the actions you took, and the results of those actions to build stronger bullet point. Managed peer-to-peer texting program, right? That was your responsibility. That was your job. You could say something like built and executed turnkey, volunteer-driven, peer-to-peer texting programs for the 2018 and 2019 election cycles, supporting more than 250 candidate and issue campaigns up and down the ballot. Right? So we're not just saying what our responsibility was, we're saying this is what we accomplished. We accomplished programs that were volunteer driven. We accomplished programs across 2 cycles. We supported more than 250 candidate and issue campaigns all the way up and down the ballot. That's a much stronger way of talking about your work than just simply saying, I managed a peer-to-peer texting program. You also want to think about how you're tailoring your experience to the particular job. So a couple of things to think about when tailoring your experience, right? What skills, strengths, and experiences do you have that are required in the job description, right? So this means going through and mapping through the job description to find those skills that are required and then matching them to your skills, strengths, and experiences. Which roles or projects have you worked on that showcase those requirements from the job description? Again, getting into the stories that you can tell about your accomplishments that you can tailor particularly to what this employer is looking for. And does your resume include industry-specific jargon or vagueness about how your experience might translate? Especially important for those of us who might be bringing experience from other industries or even changing lanes within politics where there's a certain kind of jargon we use in the field world versus the kind of jargon we might use if we wanted to go after a data role, for instance, right? So those are the things you want to consider when tailoring your experience. A couple of examples here. I'm going to use my my past experience for this example of I used to work in theater. And when I first started thinking about how to translate my theater experience on my resume, I can tell you theater resumes look entirely different, completely different than political resumes. And so I really had to back up and say, what's universal about the experience that I have in the theater world, and how can I talk about that in a way that is recognizable to people who might work in politics? So for me, a bullet point might start with something that looks like executed 20 plus stage productions or produced 20 plus stage productions, right? Doesn't mean a whole lot to someone who works in politics, but I can translate that and say, well, what that really was for me was I led staff and volunteers to execute 20 plus community events. Those plays that I produced, we can think of them as community events. In politics, we produce community events all the time. We put them on. So led staff and volunteers to execute more than 20 community events. I also taught youth acting classes. So I can think about how can I translate to get to the real heart of what I was doing there that might translate to this world I'm going into now. I trained young people on how to tell authentic stories. Right? We train voters, volunteers all the time to engage with voters and tell authentic stories. So I can think about, that's how I can sort of reframe my training experience, my teaching experience with young people. Increased attendance and viewership 25% on a 3-year-old show, right? I can translate that into, attendance at a show doesn't mean a whole lot in politics, but we put together events all the time and we try to build crowds for those events. So I increased event turnout by 25% with successful promotional programs, right? Just a little way of thinking about how you might want to translate that experience. We have an entire training called Translating Your Experience that dives much, much deeper than I can during this module into this topic. So highly recommend you check that out. The job description is always your guide about how to order your bullet points. And this is ordering your bullet points. It's another thing to think about as you're tailoring your experience, right? You want to arrange your bullet points in the order that most contributes to what the employer is looking for. So if the job you're going for has a strong focus on management, you want to bump those bullet points that talk about your management experience to the top. If the job you're focused on has a strong, or you're going after has a strong focus on training, similarly, bump any training bullet points up to the top. So you have the opportunity to decide what order do I want to put these bullet points in that really highlights the skills that the employer is looking for. What's really important to remember in all of this with tailoring your experience is there's no need to go nuclear on anything, right? You shouldn't be completely overhauling your resume every single time you go to apply for a job, right? You're thinking about what are the small tweaks that I can make to tailor it to the skills that and the experience that is most relevant and resonant to the employer. And that can be small changes, right? All right, moving on. Our question we are so often asked to summary or not to summary statements, objective statements, those statements that we see often at the top of resumes. In general, our advice is summary statements are almost not a thing that you need in a general way if you are already working in the political space. We recommend staying away from summary statements. A couple of instances where you might want to use the summary statement if you're transitioning in from another industry. You can think about a summary statement at the top of your resume to provide some context for how your resume might translate, how your experience translates, and the value that you bring. You can think about it if you are changing lanes in politics, maybe going from field to comms. Now, a lot of that can also be communicated in a cover letter. So you really have to make a call on, does this summary statement strengthen my resume, or does it draw away from my resume? And do you want to focus on the content of your resume? So it's just a little bit of a personal choice around summary statements. We tend to advise against them unless they really do add value. But if you're going to write a summary statement, we want to talk about what the keys to a good summary statement are. You want to include no more than 2 to 3 brief sentences. You want to go ahead and write in the third person. So you're writing about yourself in the third person, not with your first name, but writing about yourself in the third person. And we'll see how that is done in an example we'll share in a moment. You always want to highlight the strongest skills that you bring, tailored to the job, tailored again to what the employer is looking for. And you want to include some details that are unique to you. So I'll give you an example that we have often used in this training. This is one of our arena trained staffers who was a data analyst looking to get their first job on a campaign. They had previously worked for and done quite a bit of volunteer work with Habitat for Humanity. And so you'll see how that unique detail about them is sort of threaded through this summary statement. So I'll read it to you here. Analyst and operations professional with strong budget analysis and data skills, thrives when building things from the ground up, whether that's a financial model, an organizational process, or a house. Passionate about leveraging data analysis and visualization skills to fight voter suppression, right? So we can see just a couple of sentences written in the third person. It highlights the skills, strong budget analysis, data skills, loves to build things, and also talks a little bit about what this person is passionate about. Why do they want to do this work, right? They're interested in fighting voter suppression and they want to leverage their skills towards that. So if you are going to write a summary statement, we would suggest going in this direction, which is more of a summary statement than an objective statement. An objective statement is more about what you're looking for next, right? What you're hoping for next. And what you want to do in a summary statement, if you use one, is to connect who you are, the skills you bring, and why you want to do this work to what the employer needs. All right, so take a minute as we wrap up this third module to write what are some of the aspects of writing in your resume that you want to work on as you move forward. So take a moment before you jump into the fourth and final module to write a little bit on this question. And we will see you for module number 4, delivery and cover letters. So look forward to joining you there. Thanks.